Well, I have only experienced war on television and probably and hopefully will never see it up close. I know mostly that war is brutal and destabilizing and ends badly for most people involved. I know we've had soldiers who come back from Afghanistan and stood in our old fellowship hall telling stories about traumas that had them on the edges of their wits. And I knew a good family friend who was an AP war correspondent whose life was cut short by her own will, maybe in part because of what she experienced in the Middle East. But occasionally a story sings a different tune about war. Because war is the extreme of what we can do to each other, it often is in reflection to what we might do with one another. So here's a story you may have never heard. It's a true story about a soldier in World War II in the 1940s in Japan. It's a story about the father of a member of our church. The man was an American soldier. He was in one of those battles that was so terrible it's hard to even understand it. Thousands of men died on both sides, the American and Japanese. This man was on a night patrol, creeping along the front or some perceived border between his troops and the Japanese. And it started to rain very hard, like the rain we had in August that left 13 inches in a day. And this man and his partner ducked into a cave to hide from the rain. When their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they realized that a Japanese soldier was standing next to them with a sword pointed at them. The Japanese soldier looked scared, and he looked like he had not eaten in weeks. And for some reason, this American soldier, this father of a member of our church, looking in the eyes of his enemy who had a sword drawn on him, an American soldier who had seen his friends die in the war and who was trained to kill, for some reason in that moment, he saw this Japanese soldier's pain, his heart, his soul, his humanity. And so he did something surprising. Surprising probably to him and certainly to his enemy. He pushed the sword to one side and he gave the Japanese soldier a hug. The Japanese soldier's response was not to fight back, but rather to break down and cry in the arms of his enemy. Now, sometimes when I tell stories like this, you say, that can't be true. Well, Scooter Smith, who's sitting right here, his father was the man in this story, and you can ask him. This beautiful story that Scooter gave me after I preached a sermon where you didn't believe about another war story, is a story, I say, about revolutionary love. It was revolutionary enough that I call it holy. I call it God's love. I call it the kind of act that erases differences, that takes away our pride, that gives us what we need to love one another, even in such terrible situations as war, even now as we are hearing it told so many years later. This story is enough to make us want to be better people, to love people in our lives with a little more attention, to see our neighbors with a little less annoyance or conflict, to see our perceived enemies a little more clearly. It is the kind of love that we don't just wait for, it is also the kind of love that we must practice. It is this kind of love that we share as Unitarian Universalists who know that God's love is stronger than anything, no matter your definition or lack of definition of God. This kind of love that Scooter's father had in that moment may have been fleeting, I don't know, but it represents the love we aim to address here and this year in our theme year, All Rise for Love. And that kind of love, popularized most recently by Valerie Kaur when she coined the term revolutionary love, which is actually nothing new, but timely all the same, is the kind that Jesus talked about when he said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemies,' but I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who hurt you, that you may be children of God." And it is the same love that was taught by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, "He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love." It is the kind that has been taught over and over again through time, expressed in time of war and in time of peace, in time of strife, in time of success, to nations and to ourselves, and it does not lose its luster. Valerie Kaur is just another in a long chain of love advocates. Some of us saw her this week at Temple Emmanuel on Thursday night, where she said, "It is time to reclaim love as a public ethic." She said, "Love has been captured by greeting cards and pop songs as personal and romantic, too fickle and sentimental to be a revolutionary force. But the greatest social reformers in history grounded entire movements in the ethic of love. When we reclaim love through a feminist lens," she said, "then love is a form of sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, and life-giving." That means love can be taught, she said, modeled, and practiced. Revolutionary love is the choice to labor for others, for our opponents, and for ourselves. So when I interpret her words, I say this: it is a choice to enter into the fray of the world, not armed with rage, but with compassion and joy. It is a choice to try and live our lives where we see no strangers, where we have no enemies. It is a choice to try to practice a kind of awareness of people that we disagree with, practice a kind of curiosity about those that we don't agree with. And instead of returning to them conflict, returning to them love. It is time to find ways to return thanks and forgiveness to truth, to those who want to tell lies and blame and demonize. It is time to practice forgiveness and freedom from hate and anxiety. It is time again to do these things. And it's hard to feel like we can do this. Believe me, I know that you know that I know it is hard to return our opponents' love. It is hard to watch citizens and elected officials commit fanatical acts against our values. And rather than arm ourselves against them and go into battle to try and see in them their pain and their suffering, see in them not irredeemable heart, but lovable heart. It is hard to activate love in the world and not feel exhausted and depleted and like failures. But nothing in history tells us that we should give up or go home or practice hate. Nothing. Nothing in any faith in the world has ever said we must now practice hate. At the core of all faiths and at the core of our faith is a world that is tuned by the heart of love, that has a responsibility as individuals and as communities to practice revolutionary forms of love. It is a choice. And it requires that we do it together. And that's why the first thing when we talk about what is revolutionary in this church, I talk to you about committing yourself to a community of faith, to church, especially a church that is saying it wants to tear down the walls of pain and hate rather than shore them up. It is revolutionary to commit to a place like this. It is countercultural to be part of a church like this, to be part of a symbol of being a beacon of hope in a dim world. And when I say that to you, I want to say this to you. I want you to hear it with love, that this is not entertainment what we are doing here. This is faith coming alive and burning bright in a long history of hopeful people who built this place on an ethic of love. It is us as temporary agents of salvation as love. So when I invite you to join the church later on, I want you to think about that, whether you want to be part of that. Second, it is revolutionary to be part of and to build communities that say love does not require us to like everybody or believe in everybody or agree with everybody, but rather calls us to recognize that at the deepest level, what we share as human beings is that we are made in the image of God, that all are worthy of compassion and justice. It is revolutionary to be part of movements that again and again stood up to the forces of the world that wanted to divide us, that wanted captivity, not freedom, that wanted distrust, not hope. So when Reverend Rabel of this church, who served here from 1942 to 1963, called for an end of gradualism in the desegregation process in the school systems here in Dallas, he stood against the tide of society, which would stall those efforts until the 70s. But this church made a statement of integration in 1949. Because Reverend Rabel bet his ministry on the board voting to integrate. And after that board meeting, the board chair went up to Reverend Rabel and said, "Had we voted against integration, would you have stayed?" And he said, "No." That's the kind of leadership that has lived in this church and lives here today. In the late 1960s, the women in our congregation, like Pat Davidson, who we named the parlor down the hall for, led movements of study around abortion and brought the Roe v. Wade case to the highest court in the nation. These women walked the halls of all-male Texas legislatures so that women could own property in Texas. They brought about change in Texas that drove change across the country. Today we have come together again to preserve the right of autonomy over one's body and the freedom of reproductive choice and dignity against forces that want to imprison us and hurt us. We rise to them together in love. And in the 1970s, members of this church like Ned Fritz and others worked to preserve the Texas forests and rivers so that we did not destroy the land we live on. And today we continue to work on building sustainable environments for our future, advocating for effective action to reduce the threat of climate change, to join forces with the first inhabitants of this land, the Indian tribes that are urging us to work toward clean rivers. Later this month, we will join forces with the American Indian Heritage Association at their powwow on the Trinity River to rename the Trinity River to its original Arkakosa. Unitarians working to rename the Trinity River. That's a bumper sticker. We were early advocates for marriage equality. We've been a safe and inclusive space for LGBTQ communities for decades. We were one of the first Unitarian churches to be welcoming in the 1970s. And when we heard the story of our member, Lissa Jenkins, who told of the time during the AIDS crisis when she came into the sanctuary and witnessed Catholic priests giving confession and communion to Catholic gay men who had AIDS and would not be given those rights in their own churches, we once again hear that we are rising to the occasion to respond to love. And today we fight for the rights of transgender people in our families and in our church school and in these pews to experience the fullness of their rights and dignity under the law. And we may be fighting again about the right to same-gender marriage someday soon. The point of all this is that we have risen with love when our cherished values were under attack or when they were ignored. We have risen with love when our rights were being taken away and when they were being given. We have risen with love despite our differences to bring about the change that was needed in our communities. And we have risen because we can do more together than any of us can do alone. Like the man in the reading that Beth read today, who dragged to safety by his buddy and changed his whole life to go help him. We are called to live lives not just by changing our attitudes, but by taking action to join forces to rise to the occasions of our lives. That reading says to me that if someone can move their life across an ocean to help a friend out of deep love, have a deep gratitude, we can change the little things in our homes, like making time for one another and telling each other we care. You know how to do this. When we look at the world we are living in today with all its challenges and all its opportunities to get past the fight to real encounter and engagement, we might say that there are no bystanders. We are called to rise to a revolutionary love. And that is what our program year is all about. To rise with love for the good of all. Are you with me? Like Scooter's dad, in that moment, we are called not to see enemy, but to see each other and to find ways to love one another. Like the people who opened the doors for those Catholic gay men so that they could be blessed here in this sanctuary. We are called to open doors. Like those women who fought for each other. We are also called to fight, but to fight with loving hearts. So I'm going to ask you today to put your bodies on the line, to vote for this great love that Jesus talked about, that King talked about, that Valerie Kaur talks about, and declare today that you are part of this movement. If you believe we should rise with love for the rivers and the land, wouldn't you rise now? And if you believe that we should rise with love to confront the devaluation and degradation of our voting democracy, wouldn't you rise now? And if you believe that we should rise for our transgender children and to protect marriage for all, how are you going to rise? And if you believe that we should rise for racial equity that doesn't just address disparity, but keeps moving us toward loving one another, will you rise now? And finally, if you believe that we should rise for women's rights to control their bodies, you got to rise now. Friends, we rise today not out of some sentimental notion. We rise because we are part of a movement of revolutionary love that starts when we see one another, when we love one another, and when we move out into the world with purpose. Amen and amen.